You're listening to The Edge with Mark Thompson.
Hello and welcome. I'm Mark, and Michael Shure comes back from the road. He's our political guru, and he will be weighing in on everything from the new Congress to talking about Nancy Pelosi. You know, all of a sudden, Nancy Pelosi has become something of a controversial figure, and Michael will talk about what she's done in terms of holding her coalition together and the future of her as leader of the majority in the House. And then, very excited, in this time of constitutional crisis, you're constantly hearing that phrase thrown around, a true constitutional scholar, Brettschneider. He's a professor at Brown University, and his new book is called The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. And it is just that. It's written sort of as a guide to what executive power is all about, what you can do as president, what you can order as president, when you can start a war, when you can't start a war, when you can expel a bunch of people from the country, when you can allow a bunch of people into the country. It's a very interesting read, and he discusses a lot of this in our show today. So even if you don't have the book handy, we'll cover some of these topics in our conversation with Corey, and then we have a link on our website at edge-show.com. I very much recommend the book. Speaking of our website, if you haven't gone there, you should. There are all the shows since the beginning of our show, which is about 5.5 years old now. You can go back and listen to all the different conversations. You can hear how we've evolved. You can also tap on the Amazon link if you're going to be shopping on Amazon. Hey, look, I'm not telling you to shop on Amazon. I'm just saying if you're going to shop on Amazon anyway, please do it through our website because we get a little piece of whatever you spend because you click through our website. If you go onto our website and open up an episode, you'll see something that says Shop Amazon. So I'm going to click on that. Same Amazon as normal, but we get a little piece of whatever you spend. Or you can support the show by sending us a PayPal contribution. Many of you have done that. I shouldn't say many of you. I should say some of you have done that. And I very much appreciate it. You know, we take no commercials on this show. This show will always be free. Don't mind running at a deficit. But the trade-off is to ask for your support. And so I'm asking. To review, Michael Shure on politics, and we cover a lot of different stuff. That's about 20 minutes or so. And then Brettschneider on The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. Let's get started.
This is The Edge.
The advantage, it means.
They let guy just spit on me for no reason.
That's horrible.
Is there some comfort in uncertainty, do you think?
You're a degenerate.
Because Australian Shepherds need action.
Wow. Yeah.
This is The Edge.
That's a self-loathing term that I use.
Oh, got it.
He's back from the road. He is the man who's forgotten more about politics than most of us will ever know. He is Michael Shure, everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so
Come on,
much.
Michael's back.
It's great to be back. This is home, and I haven't been here in a while, and I'm remiss because here we did. All we did was tease an election. Then what happened? The election happened, and
you haven't really been back since the election.
MIA, yeah. They sent me out for a recount too, and
that's right. We've talked a lot about voter suppression and different issues surrounding the election. You and I have talked about it on this show, and there's been a lot of talk about it. And I'm grateful for all the talk that there's been in the mainstream media about it, because I don't think it was really much of a subject that got airplay prior to this. But what were your impressions when you went down and witnessed the recount?
Well, here's the thing. You go down, you think, oh, my God, this is Florida again. What a disaster, what a disaster. It wasn't really a disaster. It was a close election, and a close election triggers a recount. The recount now lives by rules that were learned from what was a disaster in 2000. And there are a whole host of laws, voter intent laws, that didn't exist then that exist now. It took a while because there were a lot of ballots to go through. And, you know, there's a franticness about a recount because both sides start getting together and figuring out how to win the race, and are we going to lose a race that we thought we'd won, etc. But Florida did it pretty well.
What about this stuff where, you know, we just found 4,500 ballots in the back of this church type thing?
Well, I mean, that kind of stuff is terrible when it happens, and it wasn't quite as many ballots, and it wasn't like that. They saw some of the boxes that held ballots, and people rushed to a conclusion. Well, when they looked in there, finally, it was supplies that were just being transported in boxes that held ballots. Now, it's not to say that it went perfectly either. I mean, there was mishandling of ballots, misplacing of ballots. There are a lot of them in these counties. The ballot itself was really flawed in Broward County, so you could say, well, how could they flaw a ballot again? Well, they put these ballots up there for 6 weeks, right, for the public to review. Nobody's going to go by the election headquarters to look at the ballot to see how it is, but they should. Somebody should, and they did. didn't. And so that ballot went out in Broward County, and likely a lot of the undervotes happened because of the fact that the ballot was flawed.
Because we are on the election, because you haven't been here since this election, just give us in summary, because we do have other stuff we want to get to, but give us in summary what this election said, whether this worked out as anticipated, bigger than anticipated. Just give us a state of the state.
Listen, I predicted that the Democrats would win the House, and they'd win it with about 36 seats. They won it with 40 seats. They over-exceeded, and I think I was being overly optimistic. The way that the election turned out was probably disappointing to Democrats on election night because the sexy candidates lost. But the sexy candidates, the Andrew Gillum, Beto O'Rourke type candidates, Andrew Gillum was ahead in the polls, so I shouldn't lump him in with Beto O'Rourke. Those type of candidates were the ones that were long shots, right? You didn't necessarily think that was going to happen in many of those cases. The guy, J.D. Scholten, who was running against Steve King in Iowa, boy, wouldn't that have been great if Steve King had lost, so many thought. But you got this sense that, oh, wow, the Democrats are going to take the Senate. I never had that sense. I thought it was possible. There was an avenue for them to do it, but that avenue was just full of obstacles, and they didn't do it.
That's the problem with the media the way it is, because in the lead up to the election, the, as you say, sexy candidates and the sexy stories, those shiny objects were the Ted Cruz is going to lose to Beto O'Rourke. I mean, that these dyed-in-the-wool red states are going to lose.
Stacey Abrams in Georgia, right?
I mean, huge, high-profile races. And so when the blue wave didn't extend into that area, in the media, it was played as a little bit of a disappointment.
Right. Well, I think it was because those were the stars, right? And, the Best Actor Award wasn't as exciting as the Best Supporting Actor Award this time. Though, this was unquestionably a blue wave. The Democrats destroyed the Republicans in the House of Representatives. Winning 40 seats is an astonishing victory, and Democrats should be thrilled about that. They were defending seats in the Senate. This is an old piece of information that everybody's talked about, that they should not have won in many cases. They did win in Arizona. They did win in Nevada. They held on to Montana somehow, which was surprising to me. That shows you what a good politician John Tester is, and that Steve Bullock, the governor of Montana, might have a future as a national Democrat. He's a name that we can go back to in about a year and a half and play this episode. I think that Democrats should really be happy with the way it went, and I think that the types of Democrats that were elected represented a broad swath of the party, and I think that's important for them too.
Meantime, so much has gone on, we won't be able to cover it in our brief time together, but, I mean, really so much has gone on. I'm just going to grab this Attorney General story because it strikes me as perhaps fitting into a lot of the things that we've talked about on this program before. And, of course, Jeff Sessions is gone. He's been gone now for a few weeks.
Yeah.
And in his place, there's an interim Attorney General who appears to only exist in this role to protect Donald Trump.
Yeah.
Why am I hearing that?
Well, because there's nothing that has been out there to disabuse you of that feeling yet, and he hasn't had to act on anything. He has given a lot of lip service to the fact that, no, he's not there to defend Donald Trump. But you also don't see Republicans rallying to the cause of a Mueller bill in the Senate. Jeff Flake has said, and he has said a lot, but he said he will not vote to confirm any justices until there's a Mueller bill that passes the Senate, protecting Robert Mueller's right to this investigation. Flake has not done he's notorious for not sticking to his guns.
He's all show and
right?
no go.
Yeah, right. He's been all go on this one. This is a controversial selection on many, for a variety of reasons. He wasn't the Deputy Attorney General who should have stepped in. That would have been Rod Rosenstein. And so I think that's one of the things that Donald Trump does. He's apparently done it in business, but he surrounds himself with sycophants. And when people aren't, that's when he has a problem with them. That's why he's having problems with John Kelly. That's why he had a problem with Jeff Sessions recusing himself in the first place. Not for the reasons that one would have a problem with an attorney general recusing themselves, because this was about Donald Trump, and it always is.
Whitaker has, of course, advertised the fact that you starved this Mueller investigation of money. He was a vocal spokesman for the idea that the counsel's office shouldn't exist. He was making sweeping statements on CNN and elsewhere where he said, there was no collusion, there were no laws broken, which, by the way, is funny on its face because, you have no information. You're just a pundit at that point, right? I mean, you're just, be like me saying that there's no collusion. I mean, I could say it, but I have no idea. I have no access to any information I haven't read in the paper, But Trump, having picked up these various media reports, having seen him, thought, hey, that's my guy. His legal background is not very extensive.
No, his legal background's not extensive. He was an unsuccessful Senate candidate in Iowa, but he has been someone who is outspoken on the fact that the president is beyond reproach, and that is something that appeals very much to Trump. And listen, he's not going to be there forever, and he might not even get there if there is if things happen in the courts that prevent it. But
what could happen in the court that would prevent it?
Well, I mean, there could be a constitutional interpretation that you sue the Justice Department or you sue the president for this, and that there could be some sort of interpretation. Whenever the court starts flirting with this stuff, right? They, I think, find senators then who will say to the White House, "We can't support you on this anymore." That's what happens. It may not happen directly from a court case, but you'll have Lindsey Graham go to the president and say, "Hey, this you got to go in another direction here because they're doing this now."
Yeah, it's funny. You talked about this in the very early stages of the Trump presidency, where you said, "Wait, there'll be something that will happen, and slowly you're going to see a couple of key senators turn away from the president." And you said, sort of like a flock of birds, they then will all turn away, and that's when you know that he's radioactive. That really hasn't happened yet.
It hasn't, but the things that would have triggered that are not the things that trigger us generally. They're the things that trigger senators. A huge loss in the House of Representatives, that triggers elected officials. We cannot just stick to this guy blindly all the time anymore, even going into what will be a presidential year, because that came with a cost to every single person who wasn't in a solidly red state as a senator. You had Kansans lose House seats. You had, New Mexicans lose House seats in very conservative districts. Those sorts of things, when those happen, that starts to send alarm bells.
The Trump economic policies, which is really one of the reasons that everybody dropped in line. They got the presidency, they got their Supreme Court appointments, they dropped in line and voted a tax cut through. No one really knew the details. They just knew, hey, let's get it through. We got to get this tax cut through. It was one of the most hurried pieces of legislation I've seen in my lifetime. In any case, it's all through. Great. Now, unfortunately, for so many Americans, is it the chickens are coming home to roost? Who comes home to roost, Michael?
The chickens come home to roost.
Okay, chickens come home to roost.
Yeah.
And in this case, and this is the news of the day, General Motors is closing a bunch of plants. By the way, I mentioned the tax cuts. This is also in conjunction with other economic policies. And by that, I'm talking about the trade wars and tariffs on Chinese steel, et cetera.
Which, by the way, this is a continuation of the midterm story that we just started with, because that, everywhere I went, people were talking about the tariffs and the tax cuts. And look what happened in Iowa. 3 out of 4 seats turned. I mean, you get the feeling that people are not happy who should be happy with this. Iowa really rejected the president this time.
And it's interesting you say that because, when I see various media reports, the media tends to concentrate on you use the word, and so I'll reuse it, on the sexy stories associated with these tariffs have hurt these fill in the blank, dairy farmers, steel workers, whatever, but they still love Trump. Those are the stories that are played up high. But you're saying when you actually go out there, you can find those stories, but the truth is that in numbers that matter, those hurt by these tariffs and hurt by these tax cuts, perhaps eventually, and hurt by these economic policies, they don't love Trump anymore.
Right. You don't have to get on a plane and go to Iowa to see that. You can just open the paper on November 7th and see what the results were. And the results were in the House, and in the majority of Americans voted for Democrats to take over the government. And so many of them said the tax cuts and health care were issues for them. Now, that really sucks for Republicans, right? Because health care was something that was a third rail for Democrats for a while. It's how Trump may have won, right? Saying, I'm going to undo Obamacare. It's how Nancy Pelosi was victorious in a sense, and Chuck Schumer, too, to his credit, making sure that health care was not repealed and overturned as much as they could in the minority. And then these tax cuts, Republicans having to lose their job because their constituents don't like what the tariffs have done and what deficits have done. And you think deficits aren't a big thing, but to some Republicans who vote on the economy only, they get pissed off by that.
You know, you mentioned Pelosi and Schumer. This is another story that's been now circulated, that Nancy
Right.
Pelosi's leadership is in doubt. Again, remind us, for those who haven't maybe heard you talk about Nancy Pelosi, because I feel like one of the most well-reasoned supports of Nancy Pelosi has come on this show when you explain her role in keeping her coalition together. Yeah. Who is Nancy Pelosi, and why is she taking heat, and why should she be the leader?
Nancy Pelosi is the congresswoman from the 2nd District.
She's been around for a long time.
She's been around for a long time. She was the first female Speaker of the House in history. She's been the minority leader of the Democratic Party since the Republicans took over. John Boehner then was the Speaker, and then Paul Ryan in his wake. And she is the presumed next Speaker. Of course, her caucus has to elect her in private, and the House has to elect her by a majority vote in public. And there are people who think that at 78 years old, she's too old to be the Speaker, that we need new blood, that this election in America said we need new blood in leadership on both sides of the aisle.
Is that just ageist, or is it based on policy?
I think it's both. I don't think there's something ageist about saying that a 78-year-old, when you had a 78-year-old, a 76-year-old, and a 75-year-old at the top of the leadership in the Democratic Party in Congress, it's a question of leadership, a question of ageism. I think it's a question of being able to connect with who you represent. This is the House of Representatives, right? If it was small r too, right? They're representing people, and there isn't a young voice there. Joe Crowley, who lost to Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, was younger than all of them by about 20 years. He's 56 years old. He was the young guy, and he lost because they were too old, right? So, again, ageism is a terrible thing. Nancy Pelosi at 78 could be a fantastic president and could be a great Speaker of the House, and there are 38-year-olds who would be both of those too. So I don't think it's a question of that. But I think that Nancy Pelosi has earned the job of Speaker because of how she held that coalition together, because of the defense she played with Donald Trump being in the White House and the Republicans being in the Senate, and you still have the Affordable Care Act. When she was a leader as House Speaker, she was able to push through all kinds of spending measures, the Lilly Ledbetter Fair Pay Act, and Obamacare, which she shepherded through the House. So while that's not a perfect piece of legislation, it was the legislation of the day, and it was wildly unpopular and divisive. So I think that it's important that she be allowed to continue as what she says, a transition Speaker, as they find the next leader. The other problem is it's like the Republicans, right? Democrats complained about the fact that the Republicans wanted to repeal Obamacare without an alternative. So this insurgent group of Democrats, a small number, wants to repeal Nancy Pelosi without anyone else to run against her either, which is problematic for the Democratic Party. It's to be noted that 95% of their caucus did not sign the letter to try and remove her that was brought forth by some of the other Democrats there, and people have backed away from. So I'm not concerned she won't be Speaker, and I don't think it's even unseemly that this conversation is happening on the Hill, because it's a natural thing to have happen. But I do think that they make a point. There needs to be new blood in that leadership.
I want to finish with what I think is the preeminent story of our time, and yet it's played like just another story, and it's not even on the front pages today. It was a story that was buried on a Friday deliberately by the administration releasing this report on a Friday. The most comprehensive report of its kind on climate was released. It shows a link between human behavior, that is to say, our lifestyle, our culture, the way we burn energy, the way we consume food, the way we pursue agricultural interests. All of these things are linked to man-made climate change. And it's a sweeping report. It's a peer review kind of situation, meaning that this isn't just one think tank that came up with this. This national climate assessment is A, being ignored, and B, being argued vociferously by the GOP and the president, who says, I just don't believe it.
Yeah.
I'm astounded by this, of course. Where does that leave us?
This sounds name-droppy, and I don't mean for it to. He was my boss, so I can refer to Al Gore and say he was my boss at a time. I worked for his network. I reported and anchored there. I saw him recently by chance. I mean, it's not like he takes my calls or anything. I bumped into him at a place where we were both doing a live appearance for something, separately.
Valet waiting for your car?
Yeah, exactly. And what do you tip the former vice president? And I said to him, "What's going on with climate?" I mean, he is the guru of that stuff, and he had once said to me back in the days when I was working for him that until we turn climate into something that people think about today, it's hard to get the public to act on issues that are tomorrow issues, and climate is the ultimate tomorrow issue, right? The sky's not falling today, but this is about taking care of our planet for the future so it doesn't expire. Anyway, he said, but as soon as it comes down to money, then people are going to start talking about it, and different people are going to start talking about it. And what did this report do? This report outlined how costly it is. And as cynical as you can be about money, money does matter. It matters in the way we discuss things at home, and it matters in the way we discuss things in politics. Everything we do, like it or not, revolves around money. If you are poor and you can't live in a certain place, you talk about how you wish you had more money to live there. If you are a waiter busting your hump to make money, you wish you're upset that this person didn't tip enough. All of those things. So money comes back to money in this country, which is fine. That's the way it is. I'm not complaining about it. But this issue is now something that you can touch because it has money involved in it. And it's a today thing all of a sudden. I think that's what's important.
It's going to cost the U.S. economy $155 billion every year in lost productivity. It could affect the American economy by 10% over the next century. That's huge. People hear 10%. It may not sound like a big number, but think about how big the economy is.
It's an enormous number. It's an enormous number.
But it's a fact that nothing will be done because the president is stonewalling it, and there's a coalition politically. I mean, that's what's amazing to me. We try to be even-handed. I understand that I come from the left, but I try to listen. I am a liberal, so I'm open. Yeah. Please, tell me the argument. I'm ready to hear it. I'm not staunchly dug in on whatever. I want to examine new data. And so I'm astounded that the GOP is so dug in on this issue as new data comes in. I mean, right. You'd think that they would warm. As you say, maybe it's just going to be the economy ultimately that brings them around.
It is going to be that. And here's the other part of it, is that the 2018 was a midterm election like none other because climate played a bigger part in more places. It was talked about in more places. Actually, nobody talked about it more than Bill Nelson, who lost a Senate race in Florida. 8.4 million votes cast. He lost by 10,000 votes. That's a tiny loss. Rick Scott has won every election between 0.14% and 1.5%. It's a divided state. Florida is not a red or a blue state. If it's anything, it's probably a red state. But people talked about climate. People talked about guns this year. They're only going to talk about those issues more. That's not going to go away for the next little while because it was a successful conversation for most of the people that had it.
That's all the time we have. Anything else I need to know?
Well, here's the thing. When next we meet, we will discuss in retrospect the Mississippi Senate race. I will tell you now, we don't know the result, but I'll tell you the Republican's going to win. It's Mississippi, but it brings up issues about the South that were brought up a little bit in Doug Jones' Alabama race, where he surprised and won there. He also beat Roy Jones, which anybody should have been able to do. And then it talks about the politics of the South a little bit with race. And so it'll be an interesting race for us to discuss in retrospect.
Yeah, we discussed it a bit last episode. I wish you had been part of that, but Richard Green stopped by in your stead.
Whatever.
But we're glad to have you back into the fold. He's at Michael Shure on Twitter. Shure is spelled Shure, like the microphone company, but no relation. Unless he's trying to get a table at the last minute.
Mark, you are a host who listens.
You were appreciated by one of our listeners who actually sent us a PayPal contribution, which doesn't happen a lot. You always mention they can send us something, but she sent us a little something, and then she said she enjoys the calm political musings of Michael Shure.
Apparently, somebody has seen my gravestone.
I adore you. I'm glad you're back in the fold. He is Michael Shure, everybody.
Thank you.
Yes.
You guys, you're always good. You're always good to me, guys.
First of all, it's great to be on the show with all of you and all that and all these things. I love it. And if you enjoy listening to The Edge, subscribe to The Edge on iTunes, the Stitcher, and you can totally listen to it on iHeartRadio. Edge-show.com. Stupid. Why is that dash?
edge-show.com.
And now I'm joined by J. Elvis Weinstein for my conversation with Corey Brettschneider, who has a terrific new book about the presidency and the Constitution. We're with J. Elvis Weinstein, Corey.
Okay.
And J. Elvis Weinstein is a documentary filmmaker, writer, comedian.
Great.
And written on Freaks and Geeks and
great.
original voice of Servo on Mystery Science Theater 3000. His documentary film is streamable now on Amazon Prime, right?
Yes, it is. It's called I Need You to Kill, about stand-up comedy in Asia.
Freaks and Geeks is by far, I'd say, all-time top 3 shows.
Oh, thank you.
It's amazing.
Thanks.
It's true. I mean, it's on a lot of all-time top 3 lists.
Oh, yeah. Quite a cast, too, huh?
Yeah.
That you discovered.
Not me, but yeah, it was great. It was great to see them at that point.
Right.
Corey Brettschneider is the brilliant writer of a new book. He's a professor of political science at Brown, teaches constitutional law, and you seem like the right guy for the time. The Oath and the Office is the book. It's a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. Corey Brettschneider, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here, and looking forward to the conversation. Mm-hmm.
The book is really cool because it is written as though you're going to be president, reader of this book. Here's what you need to know. You can do this. You can do that. This is the reason you can't do that. This is the reason you can do this. And all of this stuff, of course, its underpinnings in the Constitution, seems so applicable to everything today because we seem to be living in a time where a lot of stuff is being tried. You hear all of these opinions, oh, that's going to be a constitutional crisis if he tries such and such. But the truth is, and you do have a kind of a historical backdrop in a lot of the things that you talk about in the book, a lot of people who have been chief executives through time have also tried a lot of stuff.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I think there is an extreme Trump that he sort of replicates the worst moments that you find throughout history, but pulls them all together. You find individual examples, I think, of things that he's tried. For instance, I talk in the book about John Adams' attempt to really shut down the free speech of his opponents, and Trump's done that. But, you think of the treatment of people from abroad and the Chinese Exclusion Act, Trump's done that too. So you sort of collect all the worst examples throughout American history, and they're sort of, all present in this last 3 years. So, I did something for Fox recently, and I think they tried to take the idea that things were precedented and turn it into a sort of excuse for Trump, and I certainly don't want to do that. I mean, in my view, this is probably the worst, I think actually is the worst president that we've had, certainly when it comes to respect for the Constitution. And the universal theme is he doesn't get the basic job description. The oath of office that the president takes, the first second in office, is a commitment to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. That's the job. And Trump has no awareness of the Constitution, couldn't care less, and worse than that, he has a sort of disposition that he gets, I think, from seeing real estate law as something to get around and to avoid an obstacle rather than something to respect. So we're in real trouble, even though we have seen elements of things that we're seeing before.
You talk a lot about the framers, the people who created this republic and have written the Constitution. And you talk a lot about executive power and the checks on executive power. The executive power that is provided the chief executive is pretty substantial. I mean, the executive can do a lot.
Yeah. I mean, I think the framers provided mechanisms to stop a president, and I talk about that, and certainly they had an idea of restrictions on the presidency, but they also created an office, and they knew they were doing this, that had the potential for enormous danger. The commander-in-chief power alone gives the president the ability to, carry out a war. The rise of the federal government itself, just its size, over 2.5 million people, gives the president the ability to do enormous damage. Some of that I think they couldn't have anticipated, the size, for instance, of the country and of the federal government. So, we've got to do our best with mechanisms that were in some ways designed for an 18th century world. But, the book tries to be honest about the real danger of the presidency and where we are right now, especially when you have a president who's as committed as this one is to avoiding the Constitution, like the plague, or to trampling on it. But there also are mechanisms to stop a president. So the last third of the book talks about the ways in which the framers anticipated somebody like Donald Trump. They talked about a demagogue who would play to people's worst prejudices, and they laid down various devices, tripwires that we could use to stop a president like Donald Trump. The role of the states. Indictment, in my view, is something that's consistent with the Constitution, even for a sitting president, although I talk about why that's controversial. And ultimately, of course, impeachment.
I want to get to some of these things, and I promise everyone I'll get to this constitutional crisis thing, which you hear someone, that's going to be a constitutional crisis. We've got an actual...
Not going anywhere.
We've got an actual, someone who teaches, con law right here on the line, and we'll get to that. But because you've talked about some of the checks and some of the tripwires, why don't you detail a couple of those, and we'll see if they're still out there in another year.
Yeah, exactly. We've got to, I do say there's no Constitution police, so we've got to, have citizens who know about them and actively are willing to use them. One of the most important, I think, is the role of the states in resisting a president. I mentioned John Adams and his endorsement and signing the Alien and Sedition Acts, which made it a crime to criticize the president, John Adams. But it wasn't a crime to criticize the vice president, Thomas Jefferson. So the vice president at the time was in this odd situation where he couldn't criticize the president of the United States. The president could criticize him. What was he going to do? It was really an assault on the idea of democracy. He goes back to Virginia, and with Jefferson and Madison, the sitting vice president and the primary drafter of the Constitution, they get these resolutions passed in Virginia and Kentucky that say, we're not going to comply with these illegal unconstitutional acts. That, it's one thing if we'll respect federal law, it's supreme. It's one thing if Adams has his own way of prosecuting people, but the localities that we're in are not going to cooperate with this unconstitutional act. And so I say that's a lesson now, because in California, for instance, the refusal of San Francisco and Santa Clara to comply with ICE's, in my view, unconstitutional demand that they hold people who are, stopped for parking violations for 72 hours if they're suspected of being undocumented, that the refusal to cooperate with ICE is sort of in that tradition and sort of a way of using the tripwire of the states and federalism to stop a unconstitutional action by a president.
Well, Corey Brettschneider, isn't it true though that if you're not in the country legally, I mean, shouldn't you then be exposed in some way to some additional method by which you can there might be a hearing and then you're deported?
Yeah, I mean, nothing in the book and nothing even in what Madison and Jefferson did, as radical as it was, suggests that federal law isn't supreme. And, the federal government, through statute, has the ability to deport people who are undocumented. But it doesn't mean that you could do it in any way. So
when you say it's unconstitutional you said they hold somebody for a parking ticket for 72 hours, I presume that's what you're talking about. What's the unconstitutional part of that?
I think there are two parts. One is the basically profiling that's going on of using race, I think, to target Latino and Chicano people suspected of being undocumented. And then also, I don't see what the role of the states is. This is the argument this isn't my argument, by the way. It's San Francisco and Santa Clara's argument. What they say is that we don't have to comply. The unconstitutional demand is to basically try to take over the local police force and make it a unit of ICE. And basically what they're saying is we don't work for the federal government. And so that they won in the district court in San Francisco. They won in the Ninth Circuit, and I agree with them. And so it's got this sort of threefold claim. One is we don't work for you, the federal government. We have an independent right to basically govern ourselves. Two, they're worried about the racism of ICE's detainers. And then the third is, what the localities are saying is, what is it that gives us the right to even hold people in the first place, given that we don't enforce immigration law? They haven't committed any crime. They're suspected of being in the country illegally, but that's not something local police is supposed to enforce. So part of what's unconstitutional is the forcing local police to work for ICE. And then the other thing that they're saying, rightly in my opinion, is they don't actually even have the authority constitutionally to hold somebody in the way that they're being asked to, because these people haven't committed any crime under local law. So
the states are one of the tripwires that you talk about. The states can push back. You also mentioned the courts. You mentioned the circuit courts. Explain to us what the circuit courts are, how the court is structured, sort of,
Sure. The federal system has three levels. There are district courts, and then there is a sort of intermediary circuit court, and then, of course, the Supreme Court is at the top of that system. And one thing that's interesting is that in the case of Trump, one of the important tripwires are the two investigations, which are going on in two federal district courts, and there's one in the Southern District of New York, and one, of course, the Mueller investigation centered in Washington. And, the huge kind of endgame question there about that check is, can you use the courts to indict a sitting president? And a lot of people say that when a president is special, basically, that the dignity of the office means that a president can't be indicted, and the president basically is too busy, is the other argument that you hear, that as the head of the federal government, if a president was criminally charged while in office, that would debilitate the ability of this government to function. And in my view, the framers just disagreed about that. Hamilton seemed to basically have that kind of view, that impeachment had to come first and you could criminally charge a president after. James Wilson from Pennsylvania Pennsylvania disagreed with a very simple idea, and what he thought was, basically the whole idea of our system is that the president isn't above the law. And I think that even though part of what makes this a constitutional crisis is that we really do, this isn't just some weird hypothetical that law professors and political scientists are debating. We're going to face this question, I think. And, to me, it's James Wilson's answer is the right one for that simple reason. The idea of the office, to me, is degraded by allowing somebody to commit crimes and to remain there without being charged. And, I give the example in the book of, in the very beginning of the book, of George Washington's second inaugural address. And what he said was, look, I just took the oath of office, and if I violate it, subject me, George Washington, to constitutional punishment, because his idea was the office is not me. I'm a mortal person, and if I'm flawed, if I mess it up, then you need to stop me by criticizing me. That's part of it, but in the ultimate, subject me to constitutional punishment. He never specified what he meant, but to me, that certainly applies to criminal indictment as well.
Right. It seems that once you commit a crime in office, it actually becomes part of your duty of office to face responsibility for that crime.
Yeah, exactly. And, you get that, it's right there. You read a lot of these founding documents, and they're just talking to us. And Washington in the second inaugural says exactly that. He's looking at the crowd, and he's like, look, this whole idea of the presidency isn't about me. It's not about George Washington being great. Of course, he twice decided he didn't want to be king. The idea is that, that the office is bigger than the person. And so the idea that we would allow a sitting president to go free, even temporarily, is exactly the inverse of the whole design of the system.
And why do you think that? I mean, it seems, history at least tells us that Washington had a sort of unique insight into that over the rest of the founding fathers, who were sort of pushing for a more king-like figure. Why?
Yeah.
Do you have any thoughts as to why Washington had that particular understanding?
They just disagreed. I mean, you had some framers who did tend towards a kind of royalism. Certainly the worst example is John Adams, and that just got even more extreme when he became president. He even thought we should be able to bring back royal titles, which, in my view, in Madison and Jefferson's, was clearly prohibited by the Constitution. So you had people who were looking to kingly power, to England, and saw it that way. And then you had people like Madison, I think, and Jefferson as well, and their whole idea was exactly the opposite, that, they wanted a sharp break with the idea of monarchy, not just in the form of government, but in the kind of ideology and ideas that were going to govern the country. And so, it's not as simple as the framers thought one thing, and sometimes history is taught that way, that they're of one mind. But there is a strand, I think, that's true to the design of the document. And, of course, it's not just looking to them, it's looking to history, and we have case after case that affirms this idea that the president is not above the law. The most important was U.S. v. Nixon, where Nixon basically said, publicly, when a president does it, it's not illegal. And the Supreme Court of the United States said, in particular over a debate about whether he had to turn over the tapes, which he claimed to have a special privilege to keep private because he was president, and he was resisting this criminal investigation into his own wrongdoing and the wrongdoing of colleagues. And, the court in a unanimous decision, 8-0, said that's simple. They just almost word for word gave that idea. A president is not above the law, and sorry, turn him over. And that's what ultimately led to the resignation.
And what's changed now,
history,
though?
but also now.
What's changed now, Corey, because now this whole conversation has begun again. And there appears to be this sense that the next move, given the fact that in Donald Trump's case, you have someone who feels, as you say, it's like, hey, look, this is my deal. I'm going to do what I want. I think that that's just his disposition. I don't know if he thinks it through to that, but he's used to being in command of this little real estate empire, and he is not used to being held in check by any of these things. So these issues that you refer to, the ones associated with the Nixon case, they seem destined to come up again. But what's different would appear to be the consistency of the court and also of Congress.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I'm very worried about this court. I wrote a number of pieces about Brett Kavanaugh during the hearings, and of course there were lots of questions about his alleged attempted assault. But before that, even, I thought the other extremely dangerous thing about this person, at one point he seemed to have basically the idea that I'm giving you, that a president's not above the law and can be subject to indictment. When he was working for Ken Starr, the team wrote the best memo on that. Then all of a sudden, miraculously, he switches. It turns out he does it when he's working for a Republican president, and he gives a much more royalist, John Adams-like way of thinking about the presidency and starts defending something like this, immunity idea, or at least while the president is in office. And that, to me, is not just wrong, but it says something about who this person is, that he's more of a hack and a lackey rather than an independent thinker. And so I wrote a piece called Brett Kavanaugh's Radical View of Executive Power, and now that he's on the court, I'm worried that I can't say for sure that the Nixon case comes out the same way that it did last time. We, for a while, had a law that protected an independent prosecutor looking into the president, and that's the law that Ken Starr acted on. But the other vulnerability is that Bill Clinton, unfortunately, allowed that law to expire because of the overzealousness of Ken Starr. And so, what's really protecting Mueller right now, it's just not clear. There's a regulation, but that can just be revoked. And so, yes, I really do believe that in the big question of is this going to turn out the same way that things did in the Nixon era, or is he going to get away with it this way? This president certainly thinks the lesson of Nixon was that he didn't fight hard enough. And that's what I'm worried about. And I wish I could tell you for sure that the outcome is going to turn out the same way it did during Nixon.
Just because we're on this theme, there's also now an attorney general change. Right? The resignation of Jeff Sessions was demanded, and Jeff Sessions did resign. And now his replacement would appear to be thin on law, but strong on
ass kissing
and and defending this president.
Yes. Yeah, I think that's why he was chosen. He sort of tried out for the job on Fox News. There's a lot of he said things that I also, when he was running for Senate, that really speak to his lack of knowledge of basic constitutional principles.
Like what? Like what do you mean?
Challenge. He said that he thought that Marbury versus Madison was wrongly decided. That's the case that basically gives the court the power to have oversight in the first place over a president, over Congress, over our system.
That speaks to the whole justice system, right? Is that
Yeah.
Marbury versus Madison. Can you give us just the thumbnail on that?
Yeah. In the transition to power, actually, John Adams at the last second tried to appoint a bunch of judges, and Jefferson didn't want to seat them. And one of the judges, Marbury, who the wannabe judges, sued the Jefferson administration. He sued Madison, who was the Secretary of State at the time, for technical reasons. That's how the case got filed. But basically what the court did in that case is they said, we don't have the power to hear this case. He was supposed to go to a lower court, and he went to the wrong court. But what's important about it is they did two things. They, first of all, struck down a law that had been passed that would have given them the power to hear the case, and sort of declined that power. They said it was inconsistent with the role that they were assigned in the Constitution to be a court of appeals. But the really important thing that they did is, even though they didn't intervene and didn't stop that president from doing what he wanted to do, they said we could do so if the president violated the Constitution. And they laid out this basic principle that in our system, the Constitution is the supreme law, and the courts, if they need to, can enforce it even against the president and even against Congress. And so by saying Marbury versus Madison is wrong, it's sort of a, it's, a bizarre statement. Nobody on the Supreme Court thinks that. Nobody serious in constitutional law thinks it's wrong. But it also challenges the idea that the court could provide oversight of a president, and that right now is an extremely dangerous idea.
And that's a shorthand to Trump as well, which is, hey, I won't let the court hold you responsible for anything.
Yep. I think Trump couldn't make sense of, I don't think he really understands the role of the court. When he was campaigning, he talked about his sister had found that the partial birth abortion ban as a member of an appellate court, the federal system, was unconstitutional. And he said, I don't know why my sister signed that bill. So, he's really at the level of, how a bill becomes a law.
That's the
schoolhouse rock.
That's the scary difference is that, previous presidents who have challenged the Constitution were sort of up for the intellectual argument.
Right.
And that's just not the case here.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, some of the bad ones, in my view, and we could talk about why, but Wilson, for instance, was a terrible disrespecter of free speech. He was terrible on race issues, but, he knew what he was talking about
Right.
when he was doing that. And this sort of just lack of caring that's what puts this at a different level.
But I would say that while Trump may be laughable, he has the cult of personality that is apparently the shiny object that everyone has fallen in love with. The media's fallen in love with Trump because they can't wait to see what he's going to do or hear what he's going to say next. And as a result, he's gotten all of this free media, and that's really what carried him to public office. But beyond that, more to your point, he doesn't have to understand anything because he surrounded himself with this crew that is doctrinaire on one level in terms of being strong right-wingers. There's a religious right arm to all of these. But more, again, to your point, they're guys who are legislative ninjas on this, and they are going to try to pack the court with Trump henchmen. And when I say the courts, I'm talking about the circuit courts that you've talked about. And it seems as though all of the X's and O's are going to be well handled by this crew. As you sit back and look at it, does that sound right?
Yeah. I mean, in the beginning, we had a serious advantage, which was in trying to stop him. He had terrible lawyers around him, or he had Obama holdovers that he wasn't listening to. And so, when Giuliani gets on television and says, well, Trump had this Muslim ban, and he asked me to try to make it legal, that's the best ally that you could hope for.
Right.
Somebody's just admitting what's going on. And, the sort of outright bigotry, unconstitutional motivation for some of the policies just made it easy to stop. Now, over time, the travel ban is a good example of this. They just started getting better lawyers in, rewriting, being crafty, and trying to cover up this sort of demagoguery with legal niceties. And, the jury's still out. They've succeeded in some ways and not in others. One hopeful thing is that, I really worry about this Attorney General, partly because of his views. Also, he's never been confirmed by the Senate. So one hopeful thing is I think they have made a mistake here, and hopefully courts will intervene. Kellyanne Conway's husband, George Conway, and the former acting Solicitor General Neil Katyal had a great op-ed in the New York Times saying that, this appointment is unconstitutional, full stop, and courts need to intervene. So I don't know. He is getting better lawyers around, but he also continues to make missteps, and I think that the appointment of Whitaker might be one of them.
One of the things that you do in this book, The Oath and the Office, a guide to the Constitution for future presidents, is you present different situations. So you say, should you fire an attorney general who appoints a special counsel to avoid a conflict of interest to look into wrongdoing by your staff? And you say, definitely not. Your oath demands that you broadly respect the values and ideals of the Constitution. But you go on to say, but the truth is that nothing in the Constitution currently gives courts the power to prevent you from firing your attorney general, and so on. So you speak to this precise point in your book.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I saw it coming, frankly, that the system as it's currently structured has a lot of trust in the president, that basically the oath will be taken seriously and the president won't disregard it. But I think we see now with Trump, and really we should have learned from Nixon, that that's not going to cut it. And so when, a president disrespects the oath continually, like this president, it's really Congress that has to step up. And one very clear point that really I'm going to be on Morning Joe in the morning talking about this is this need to protect Mueller, and the bill that is being fought about today and tomorrow in the Senate. It's been voted out of the Judiciary Committee but hasn't been brought to a floor vote. Would just be legislation, very simple, that would say that the president cannot fire the special prosecutor, and that if he tried to, there would be judicial intervention would be required to stop him. Was it Ted Lieu who brought that legislation? He was a supporter, and it's gained favor even with Republican members of the Senate. So Jeff Flake right now is its biggest champion. Lindsey Graham voted for it in the committee, so it's a real bipartisan bill.
Wow, having Jeff Flake as a champion for something, that's like it's like building.
I mean, for now, right? That's the worry.
He's the Jenga tower we need.
Yeah. He is making some progress, and he's done one thing that, despite the many disappointments that he's given us, is that he said that he won't vote to confirm any more federal judges, and they have a judge that's coming up that they need his vote on. And so, one thought is that might be sufficient to get the vote.
Doesn't Trump have to sign this bill, though, too?
He does, absolutely, and he could veto it. He likely will veto it. But, then one good thing that would come out of that is then I think it gets even clearer for the country of who we're dealing with. We now have a Democrat House, and that would be grounds, in my opinion, to not just start an investigation, but to start to consider, more forceful tactics, including impeachment, the sort of final and ultimate way to check a president.
We've talked about impeachment on this program before, and it appears to be an exercise that is, first of all, you need the Senate, right? And
Sure.
we don't, even assuming that there'll be some defections, the Senate is not sufficiently in a camp that I would think under any circumstances.
Well, we're all just waiting for a tipping point, like happened with Nixon and Goldwater coming to the White House and going, "You don't got us anymore."
Yeah,
right. Yeah, and Nixon, the impeachment bill, was in the Judiciary Committee when he resigned, and they had voted it out. And he was anticipating that he probably couldn't make it. I'm not sure, what the vote count was, but the point was that they, saw it as a moral principle. In fact, the subtitle comes from a member of that committee, Republican member, who said, I hope that this vote is a guide to the Constitution for future presidents. And, they, I guess, weren't reluctant to try something, even though they weren't confident that they had the vote count. And, when I started talking about the Protect Mueller bill, well, you see a version of it in the book, and I've been talking about it on and on. People said, this will never happen. But I think now, as we get closer, you see that we've just got to try things, and we've got to be aggressive. And the book is very optimistic, and I'm an optimist. I think that ultimately these principles aren't just a matter of partisan politics. And, some sliver, certainly, of the Republican Party will start to see it even in the Senate. And I don't know, maybe it will be enough to force them out.
I think we're seeing that the Constitution itself is a very optimistic document. Because it's counting on someone operating in good faith.
It is. I would say it's both optimistic and also skeptical. So in many instances, certainly the oath itself, and there's an understanding that a president will have these obligations. But the tripwires are there for exactly the reason that assumes that there could be a demagogue. And the framers use that term all the time. In fact, I think it was their working thesis that we have to assume the best, but also plan for the worst, and govern in some ways also like we're a race of devils is sort of a phrase that got tossed around. And the tripwires that are there, the role of the states, the role of indictment, the role of impeachment, all those things help us out. And the independent role of the House, too. They can investigate on their own alongside all of these other things, and so that's another thing that I'm looking for.
I feel as though you discuss early on in the book, I think, the executive power issue, how much you can do as president. And again, the book's written from the standpoint of, okay, you're in the Oval Office. Now, you want to do the following.
There was a book years ago called You Are Going to Prison, and it sort of feels like that same sort of doomed.
Yeah.
That should be my subtitle.
Yeah. But here, the oath in the office takes you to, okay, you're sitting in the chief executive chair. Here's what you can do. And the truth is you can do an awful lot with executive power. In fact, you detail historically what's been done, some pretty heinous things and some pretty good things.
Yeah, that's right. And, one thing I wouldn't want to say, it was part of where we started, is that you can just look to history and, you see that things are fine because some of the most egregious policies of the country came from the president. So take Japanese internment, even though in many ways Roosevelt was a terrific president, and I think he did more than anyone to really shape our current constitutional understanding. He also signed an executive order rounding people up based on race. And, we faced in the travel ban case the question of whether or not we were going to, in a serious way, repudiate that decision. And the court, in my opinion, did something really awful. They did repudiate the decision. They said it was wrongly decided. It couldn't happen again, rounding up or internment. But they also upheld a ban based on religion. So we're I guess we're not out of the woods by any means. And over time, there's the idea of the Constitution, the mechanisms, the Bill of Rights, the things that we're supposed to uphold. But presidents have just strayed from that. And really, The only thing that's going to save us, frankly, is it's not going to be this court. I'm hoping to some extent Congress, but it's really voters. And so for me, the next presidential election has to be a referendum on the Constitution. It has to really be a way that the American people see that this is not a normal partisan battle, that if this president is miraculously still standing for re-election, that, it's a vote on the future of the republic.
You mentioned religion in the context of the travel ban. You talk about it in your book in some detail because the framers, depending, and also as the Constitution is interpreted and as the chief executive's office evolved, there was a tug of war about how much religion there should be. I mean, we know separation of church and state, but this is a huge ongoing issue for these guys.
Yeah, and I think in some ways we've gotten away from the vision that James Madison had. I mean, to me, the text of the Constitution, the most important maybe part of it is in the first part of the First Amendment. It talks about that Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. And what that means is that when we make laws, we can't do it based on religion, full stop. We have to find a vocabulary that's common to all of us. And you have a right to free exercise to practice your religion, but you can't impose religion on another person. And, certainly the rhetoric of this president, the rhetoric of the vice president, in particular Mike Pence, is the opposite of that. It's the kind of theocratic rhetoric that couldn't be more at odds with the First Amendment and with what Madison, thought of as sort of the crucial, not just provision, but the founding philosophy of the country, that we wouldn't be a theocracy.
And it's completely cynical and insincere when coming out of the lips of the president.
Oh, God, yeah. And, the sort of, you can look at the prayer breakfast. I talk about the prayer breakfast, for instance.
Yeah, you talk about the fact that the prayer breakfast was just like one thing. It was the president was begged to show up at, and now it's become a thing.
Yeah. And, it was pretty moderate, I think, too, throughout time. They used it as a place to privately, to pray, but to also talk about commonality. And that's really changing. I think if you look at some of the speeches that were made at this prayer breakfast, which, by the way, my understanding is that they've moved some of these events, or if not the prayer breakfast itself, but prayer-like events more and more to the White House. It is a Christian theocratic conversation that's being had, and the statements that are being made. And the whole founding idea was that we weren't going to do that. We were going to have a common ideal. Religion would be welcome, but all religions would be. And that's one of the worst things about this president. I talk about the role of the president in the bully pulpit, and using the bully pulpit to articulate that pretty complicated idea. I think that we're not a Christian nation. We're a nation of everyone. George Bush did that well after 9/11. He could have totally drummed up his base, but instead he said that Islam was a religion of peace and made clear that it has an equal place in America. This president doesn't do anything like that. He just, will use whatever he can, including appeals to a kind of theocracy if it serves him. Of course, he's not a religious person, but he'll fake it for the moment.
That, or they gave us $280 billion a year. I'm not going to walk away from that just because of some assassination.
Right. Exactly.
Well, he has a part to play, Trump. He knows what his part is. He really is a photo op president, and he has an understanding of a photo op actor, which is virtually nothing. The problem is that he wants to benefit. This is not in your book. This is my interpretation. But he wants to benefit himself and his company through the various dealings that he and policy decisions that he makes every day. And that's clear. And so, but that does bring me to another question. And this, I'm trying to remember if it's covered in the book or not. That emoluments thing and these conflicts. Yeah.
I end with it. Yeah.
Okay. Sorry. Thank you. What are the realities concerning the emolument clauses and these conflicts?
It's not one of the toothier clauses, it seems like.
Well, one thing I always say about it is it's got a branding issue, like emoluments. Like, what the hell is that?
Right.
I mean, what it means, it's such a simple idea with a terrible name. Maybe we could come up with a better one. But
it's like Steve Miller coming up with the Pompatus clause.
Yeah. I mean, all it means is that you can't use the office, just as you said, for your personal piggy bank for profit. And you can't make money off it. So when Donald Trump is threatening to recognize Taiwan, and then all of a sudden China recognizes his intellectual property that's pending in a dispute, and then he drops that idea. The framers thought about that. They banned what they called foreign emoluments, benefiting from a foreign government. And, this is one of those provisions that isn't just an isolated thing. It also is about the fundamental philosophy. Monarchs, that's what they used the office for, was to make money and to use foreign relations to enrich their treasury, their personal treasury. And the framers thought deeply about that and said, we're not going to do that. So Washington, in the first inaugural, it's the thing he stresses the most, is that he's not going to basically be the recipient of benefit from the office. Now, this guy liked money. When he moved to Philadelphia, he picked the nicest house. There was had to have at least 25 stables, the house that he was going to live in. But what he wasn't going to do was to let that sort of love of money and living well interfere with the idea that this government wasn't for that purpose. It was off limits. So, that's the idea of the clause and limiting the requirements about the salary. All of these things, I think, are built in there to send that message that this isn't President Inc. It's an independent office for the public good.
And it is a service. You are.
Yeah,
it is a position of service. Yes.
Exactly.
Well, it would appear that that's completely antithetical to Trump and the people around him, Jared and Ivanka and so on. The people who have the most control and access to the president seem to be exploiting the office for personal gain the most. Is there a constitutional mechanism for holding any of them in check? There
are these emoluments lawsuits that I hope succeed. One of them brought by the state attorney general, I believe, of Maryland and Washington, D.C., about the hotel. There's this Trump hotel that he keeps sort of touting and that he hasn't divested from.
Where foreign dignitaries coming to have audiences with the president or policy discussions, they buy entire floors for weeks at a time.
And he's not certainly doing anything but discouraging that. So there's one suit about that. I think the suit also mentions the foreign emoluments clause. And there's a suit by a group called Crew. So there are a number of these around the country, and they're moving forward. I mean, the process of constitutional law in the courts is slow. So it's happening, but it's happening very slowly. I mean, the other mechanisms we've talked about, certainly to me it's an impeachable offense, the violation of the emoluments clause, the refusal to divest the assets or put them into a blind trust, as every modern president did since Kennedy. That's the sort of thing that the House should be talking about in this next session, and that I think they will. And then, of course, the outright theft that the business is engaged in, the fraud, basically, at the Southern District of New York. So, we've got a role for the states. Those are the Attorney General, which we talked about, a role for the prosecution, and then certainly a role for Congress.
It definitely seems like we're hitting that point where the system is starting to catch up to the events. I mean, we've been living in this time where events unfold at such an alarming and high volume rate that it's just daily there seems to be a new offense, and it does seem to feel like some of these cases are starting to make it to the court, and some of these chickens are coming home to roost.
Well, also the amount of corruption in this administration, the Pruitts, the Wheelers, cabinet officials on down the line that have huge conflicts and are using the taxpayer dime or just pocketing the taxpayer dime in different ways. I mean, there are just so many of them.
Yeah, and you have to believe that the system will be upheld and will stop this, because it's a perfect storm. If I think of all the constitutional ideals that the book talks about, Trump is the opposite to each of them. Right. I mean, almost like a perfect example for each of these chapters of what not to do.
Well, you talk about war, Corey. I want to get to that before we lose you here. But you talk about war because doesn't the Constitution require Congress to declare war?
Absolutely. And I say there that we need a new War Powers Act. The current one is a disaster, to restore the original balance, which is that the president is commander-in-chief and Congress declares war, and that means initiates war. And presidents over time, not just, including Obama, I say in the Libya example, have really just taken it upon themselves to assume that they can do what they want. So Trump's frightening moment with the dictator of North Korea, now his friend, seemed to assume that he had the ability to launch a first strike. And that is completely unconstitutional, but modern presidents, I think, don't recognize that. So this one, Ted Lieu, I believe, is the chief sponsor of, and I think is going to introduce it in the next Congress early on. Again, he's already introduced it, but they're going to push for it. There's a first strike bill that would make it clearly illegal and reiterate the constitutional principle that a president cannot launch a first nuclear strike. And, that's an example where I think we've totally lost the meaning of the Constitution, need to restore it.
When they were writing the Constitution and in the early days of the Republic, the idea of a war was something that could be discussed and approved over the course of weeks because it took, frankly, that long to collect all the horses and all the men to get a war together, to get ships or to get troops. And the idea of a nuclear war that you can launch, or even a conventional war now with ballistic missiles of all sorts, you can get it all launched within 7 minutes. So it's as though technology has made that which was in the Constitution obsolete.
Is the central issue here redefining war, or is it redefining powers?
Yeah. I mean, I think we need to, the speed is exactly the problem, that the framers, they realized that the loss of doing it the way that they set it up was that it was going to slow things down. And then they said, Joseph Story had the best statement about this, we want to slow it down because think of what the consequences are of speed. And far from being irrelevant, that becomes even more relevant in the case of nuclear war. I mean, the idea that this unhinged, let's be polite about it, president could launch a first strike nuclear weapon that could destroy the world. I mean, the current setup gives literally no legal way to stop him. I mean, the Constitution says he's not supposed to look to Congress, but we haven't created a mechanism. He controls the nuclear suitcase, which gives him the launch codes and the ability to communicate with Central Command to release those weapons.
And to be fair, that was born of a need to respond to a real threat from, at the time, I think, it was a Soviet threat, a communist threat from China, whatever. But the point being, we don't have time to discuss this. The missiles are on their way, and we have to. That's the way the whole plan was hatched.
Yes, that's right. I think that the sort of framers' idea of slowing things down gave way to an idea that in the current world, and given the dangers, that we have to allow for immediate response and for speed, and actually even for the ability of the president to decide in some scenario, I guess, that a first strike would be warranted. Now that to me is when you see Trump, it makes us think about whether the framers were correct to oppose that view. And in my view, not just Trump, but also, I tell the story in the book about Richard Nixon's drinking. And basically the coup that went on where the Secretary of Defense, Schlesinger, said, if you get a crazy phone call from the president ordering a strike, don't do it in the middle of the night. Now, that's illegal. I mean, there's no mechanism.
That's a constitutional crisis.
It was a true crisis because of this guy was drinking. And, there was a moment where he said to Alan Cranston, the senator, I could blow up the world at any moment. And he was cavalier about it. He was drinking. He was unhinged. And this, when I look at Nixon and I look at Trump, and I think who is the more mature, rational person, I think I'm going to give it to Nixon.
I will take drunk Nixon over sober Trump.
Yeah, I think I would too, exactly. So that tells me we've got to, rethink our assumptions about things like who has the power to launch a first strike. And so, Congressman Liu's bill is going to be very controversial for all the reasons that we're talking about. It's not an easy scenario. But when you have a president who is this dysfunctional, I think we do well to think about Joseph Story and the framers and the idea of slowing things down just a little bit. Now, I don't think, by the way, I think the other solution might come from technology, because the ability in modern communication to get a fast vote on war, you don't have to actually convene the Congress in a multi-day process. It could be that there is a sort of a recognition that we need speed there. So
text war to 5022.
Yeah, I mean, we could give Congress an app.
Up or down.
Yeah,
a red button app to vote. Yeah.
What I don't want is this one crazy man making the decision for us.
No.
Yeah. And when we hear so many pundits saying this would provoke a constitutional crisis, the firing of Mueller would produce a constitutional crisis, you can fill in the blank would produce a constitutional crisis. What does that mean? What does constitutional crisis really mean?
I think it touches upon the themes we've been developing through the whole conversation, which is that, the framers assumed that a president would act well. They provided some mechanisms for stopping a president when he or she acted badly or contrary to the law. But there are holes and gaps. And when a president exploits those gaps or finds them, and there's no way to either disregards the law or the law is unclear, like firing Mueller is an example, we're in real trouble. What do we do? And the lack of an answer, the sort of fact that somebody like like me who's studied constitutional law for my whole adult life, I can't just tell you, here's the answer, here's how this thing gets solved. That's what makes this a crisis. And, that's why I wrote the book, is because we are in the midst of an instance where all these questions, you know how boring it used to be the most boring unit in constitutional law used to be hiring and firing. Students' eyes would glaze over, like, oh, who cares about this prosecutor and who could fire him? Right. And now, the fate of the republic seems to hinge on whether a president can hire and fire at will. So that's what a constitutional crisis is. It's when the mechanisms seem to erode and the president finds gaps in the law that he or she can exploit to really collapse the system.
There's so much good stuff in this book, The Oath and the Office, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents. Corey Brettschneider, and there'll be a link to it on our website, edge-show.com. It'll take you right to where you can buy the book. You talk a lot about free speech in the book as well, how the president, as chief executive, you may want to shut up a journalist, you may want to stop and shut down a number of different things that are associated with criticism, but that you're really, this First Amendment, this free speech thing is a real immovable object, it would seem, for the chief executive.
Yes. I mean, it should be, and I think Madison and Jefferson were clear about that any president that threatened to put his or her political opponents in jail was violating partly the idea of the text, that Congress shall make no law abridging free speech, and the assumption was that carried over to a president. But also that it wasn't just any provision. It really was about the right of the people in a democracy to have opinions, to think for themselves, to be able to criticize leaders. That's what the whole thing was about, the resistance to monarchy. It was kings that, had subjects that they beat into submission. So, that's why that idea is so important. It was there at the framing, but it's also been trampled on during the Adams administration, during Wilson, and now you have a president who just doesn't get it. I mean, he sees no value in this thing, and that's very worrying.
Well, you mentioned, is it the Sedition? Was it the Sedition Act where they? Yeah,
yep.
That was the Sedition Act. Yeah, the Alien and Sedition Act. Yep. That's in the book. Yeah, something happened today. I want to get your quick take on. That is, the General Motors company has decided that they need to close a bunch of plants. It's suggested in response to tariffs that the president had imposed upon steel and other component aspects of a car. And as a result, it made factories in this country vulnerable. But because of a number of different economic strategies that President Trump and his administration have imposed, I'm talking about the tariffs particularly, General Motors is closing a bunch of plants. A bunch of people are going to be unemployed. And this really goes against the narrative that the president was getting out there, both on the campaign trail and then as he became president. He today threatened General Motors, saying, if you close these plants, I'm going to take away subsidies that you benefit from. Can the president do that?
I'd have to think about the constitutional issues there. I mean, it doesn't seem like a free speech issue, and, I'd have to go through them. There have been moments like this where certainly the courts have intervened. The most famous one is Truman tried to basically stop a strike and seize steel mills based on emergency powers. And the court said, where do you get these from, basically? There were all sorts of legal restrictions on what he could do. But if the Congress has given the president power to give subsidies or not, then, yeah, he might well be within his legal rights in doing it. He often just sort of acts without being careful. A sort of more normal president would consult with Office of Legal Counsel and attorneys to make sure that the statutes passed by Congress authorized these actions that he's proposing. They might well, but knowing this president, he also just might not have done that.
Yeah, he might have just pulled that out of his holster without checking with anybody. Yeah.
Exactly.
Well, you discuss how to stop the president. You discuss so many different things, everything from war powers. You discussed even that example that you just gave of Truman. And the steel mills. So it's really a great read. The Oath and the Office, it's called, A Guide to the Constitution for Future Presidents, Corey Brettschneider. So now you are our constitutional lawyer in residence.
Everybody needs one these days.
Absolutely. It's a golden age for constitutional scholarship.
It is. of a sudden like the celebrity that comes with this job.
It's great. So you're Morning Joe, then you cruise over to CNN, then yeah. I know. Do you have any time for your students anymore?
Yeah, I'm teaching a great class it's awful, frankly, what's happening to the country, and watching it happen in the beginning and just feeling sort of helpless like everyone did was almost a 9/11 like moment, watching this president say what he said during the campaign. But there are good things. I mean, to me, the hopeful part is that by talking about these things, we sort of restore the Constitution to be a central part of American culture, and the students in particular really care about this stuff in a deep way. It isn't just abstract to them. So I'm teaching a class on the presidency and the Constitution, and it's a really engaged group, and so I don't know. I'm hopeful. My students seem to really be motivated to make the world a better place and to stop this from happening again, what we're seeing with this president.
They're the future. I mean, I hope we have a future, and I hope those guys can, people like your students can affect positives in that future. So, good luck.
We're counting on.
I don't think the students from Brown are the problem.
The students from Brown. Listen, we may call upon you from time to time. It's really great to have you in the mix.
It's a great group, and Mark, I really enjoyed our conversation on the David Feldman show. And
I met Corey on David's show.
Okay.
And Freaks and Geeks, man, that's my show.
Oh, well, thank you.
It's so cool, Corey. Hey, thanks for everything, man. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Great, and thanks so much for reading it so closely and for such great questions from both of you. Thanks so much.
Good
Thank
stuff.
you. It was
All right,
fun.
Corey Brettschneider.
Bye.
Thanks, Josh.
My pleasure.
Hope you enjoyed our show. Loved having you here. Thanks for all the ways you support us. And until next time, bye-bye.
If you enjoy listening to The Edge, support them by subscribing to The Edge on iTunes, Stitcher, and you can listen through the iHeartRadio app. Get busy listening.
edge-show.com.
edge-show.com.